All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is John Fuller. I'm a human development and family specialist with the University of Missouri. Today I have with us Sherry Nelson, who has been with the University of Missouri for 23 years. She is a regional human development specialist. Sherry has been an Extension Disaster Education Network delegate for Missouri since 2003. Sherry also serves on the MU Extension Community Emergency Management Program leadership team and serves as the Northeast Region Chair for this program. She began her first disaster work in 1993 as a flood counselor for the Department of Mental Health Services for Missouri while finishing her Master's of Social Work degree. She learned that during this time that behavioral health care for survivors and self-care are critical for disaster recovery, but often neglected. After coming to MU Extension in 1996, she volunteered for years later when the University of Missouri Extension Services decided to implement an emergency management team in each region of the state. She is trained with the Community Education Response Team and worked with numerous long-term recovery committees in Northeast Missouri. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Ms. Sherry Nelson.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that introduction. And I guess when I was writing it, I must have done a little bit with my grammar that wasn't very helpful for you. I'm just kidding. Uh, what I'd like to do today is talk, as we talk about this whole notion of leading employees into disaster response and recovery, is that I'm going to really focus more around recovery and things that we can do about preventing a second disaster. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. So some of the objectives that I had for what I want to talk about today is that I want to help you to understand the disaster's nature and mechanics, if you will. Also to help identify individual and community psychological responses to a disaster, and what actions are needed before, during, and after to help to foster resiliency for people in their communities, because it really is more about the community issue, not just the individual, but as we talk about this. So I'm going to start out with this diagram to kind of just give you a little bit, talk about phases of disasters. I know that we separate all these out, but there is some overlap between them. But we usually, when we're talking about it, is we talk about mitigation, preparedness, recovery, and response. So mitigation are the kinds of things that we do to reduce or eliminate consequences of a hazard. So it might be like we put a levee in if we have a vulnerability to floods. Preparedness is something that's maybe a little more immediate. So this might be things that we do. We get our go kits, we make our family kits, we have a plan and that kind of thing, so that we're reducing our vulnerability. It also gives us a sense of control. Response is that time when we're trying to stay safe. There's a direct effort by an organization. So we often think about our fire departments, our law enforcement, different kinds of groups like that. It can be citizens too, because often citizens are the first that may be on a scene when something happens. And what we're doing then is trying to keep people safe or get people safe in that. And then the last one here is recovery. And this is really about any activities that we're taking to try and move that community back into a state close to where it was before, or those individuals in a state to where they were before. We're not going to go right back to where we were. We're going to always have a new normal once we've had a disaster. So that's just one of those important things to keep in mind as we talk about this. The overarching thing at the top there was something that really got added after 9/11, and that is about trying to prevent events and those kinds of things from occurring. And when we talk about that aspect, it's still part of mitigation, if you will, that we're doing. So it's about trying to keep us from being vulnerable to disasters as we go along. I always think that having a little humor around disasters is wonderful. I started, as John said, in 1993. That was the first disaster that I worked. And it really did feel like Lake Mississippi out there. I was over in the Columbia, Missouri area, and I can remember standing in Boonville and looking across what should have been a farm area from the bluff that I was on, and it was a big puddle of water out there. It wasn't a, well, it was probably a lake. It was huge, and it was just unfathomable about what it was. Now, this was very early on that this humor came up. We thought it was less humorous. This was in July of 93. But at the same time, why I brought this up is that even though it's been a while back, we'd never seen something like this before. And the issue was, is we were doing what we called flying by the seat of our pants. Things that we were told for guidance. I was a flood counselor on Monday, might be different on Tuesday. It might change again on Thursday. We never knew. There were a lot of things that kept changing. It was a moving sort of thing. So in some ways, it's kind of like what we're going through right now with the COVID, is that there's a lot of things we don't know, and we're constantly updating, if you will, in terms of the kinds of things that we see going on. So there's a lot of uncertainty. There was then, and there is now as we go through this. What I'm not going to do today as we talk about these different aspects is to try and turn you guys into counselors or train you for counseling or anything like that. We're not doing that today. This is about how we can support people and communities as they go through that recovery process. It's important that we understand, or we think about what we're doing so that we can reduce the amount of psychological and social impacts as we move forward in what's going on. Little COVID humor, well, maybe it's a little early for that yet. I don't think we know where we're at with some of our humor around COVID, but I thought this was a little cute. So how many of you have ever experienced a disaster? I'm just gonna throw up a list here of different kinds of disasters that are out there. We don't want to forget that last one since it's real current. But the question might be is that, have you actually been in a disaster where you were there when there was a tornado or flooding or some other incident? Or were you actually impacted in a different way? Because I wasn't in New York when 9/11 happened, but I went to a training some years later, and I'm going to say it was probably 5 or 6 years later. And I remember that when the person who used that example asked us to talk about where we were, the emotions in that room were still pretty raw. And that was post-disaster. And people talked about their experiences and what that meant. Lots of tears. So even though we are not directly impacted, we may be impacted because of media and other things that are in the realm. Or we may have family members that are in those areas when a disaster happens. So we have a lot of input by that. And so we are impacted in that way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So what about disasters? They happen, usually we have one at least once per day globally. Thank God it isn't once per day every day. And we see that frequency is often climbing because of what we're seeing with our climate change. Although we have fewer people who are being killed by natural disasters because we have pretty good warning systems for that. We are still seeing more people being exposed to it. disasters are often things that are happening when the protective mechanisms that we as a civil society put up fail. And the morbidity to our exposure, and that's talking about that psychosocial stuff, is increasing because of what is going on. There's a lot of portions of health that lie in these social and mental health domains, and our health is impacted by that. And so at the bottom of the screen here, it talks about psychosocial care describes population-based interventions, and they're not the same as when we go see a counselor, for example, or we end up our primary care doctor because of how we're feeling or not feeling well, as it were. So those two systems, those primary care and those mental health specialists, that's a very overburdened system, and there's a lot of things that we can do on a population-based intervention that can help people get through these difficult times. So what's really important is that we recognize that stress is a very normal reaction. And you're going to hear me say this more than once. It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I certainly wouldn't want to be those pigs down there in the middle of that thing, but I can't imagine what the farmer would be feeling about that either. So disasters that cause the most psychological effects for people are one where we have huge amounts of damage going on. And that means that we may have a situation where Greenburgh, Kansas, for example. I'll pick on Joplin too, because that's another good example where we had a lot of damage across an area. And in the case of Greenburgh, it pretty much wiped the town out when that tornado went through. Ones that create serious ongoing financial problems. I think right now COVID is a good example of that. But when communities and individuals are impacted a lot financially, it makes it difficult. 40% of our businesses do not come back after a disaster. And this is more serious when we start talking about rural towns. When we talk about what caused a disaster, is it a natural or a technological kind of disaster, or is it one by human intent? So when I think about, because of where I live up here near Quincy, Illinois, and the 93 flood, is that there was a guy who decided to blow one of the levees during the 93 flood, and when that breached, we had a lot of problems up in this area. I shouldn't say we, I didn't live up here at that time, but it really was very anger producing, much more so than if we have a natural disaster, which is usually seen as an act of God kind of thing, or something along those lines. Technological disasters are when we have things that we may have some kind of system that fails in terms of a mechanical kind of system, and that causes, can cause some kind of disaster. 3 Mile Island might be an example of that. And then the last one here is when we have high levels of trauma or injuries, threats to life and loss of life. The level of destruction is what is the primary consideration here for people's life that causes them to have more behavioral health issues and that kind of thing. When we look at the prevalence of behavioral health issues, usually it's 2 to 3 times higher than in the general population. And so we usually see a couple of things go on. We have acute reactions that usually happen in 1 to 3 months, and that's the majority of people. And then we have long-term things that may happen beyond that 3-month period. There might also be some diagnosable disorders that come up, but there's also a lot of people who are not at that diagnosis, or that they're at that subsyndromal kind of symptoms that are going on. The other thing is, though, is that many will report that they're having physical symptoms or somatic symptoms. And so, again, we have that normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So what do we see when we talk about stress in adults? I've got a nice large list here for you to take a little time looking at. If you've been in a disaster or been impacted by a disaster, even though you weren't actually there, you may have experienced some of these. I'm going to pick on one here. I noticed that I was being pretty irritable here, and I finally said, shut the news off. All they're talking about COVID, and every time we talk about it, I start getting upset and angry, so I shut the radio off and things got better. There's a number of things that go on for people. The shaken belief system is important because now we feel like our world's not safe. We see increases in marital stress and possibly domestic violence. It impacts all areas of our lives as we look at this. And we often see a number of people that will have PTSD, anxiety, and depression problems. Those are very, very typical in terms of what we're looking. And again, it's about that disruption for both the individual and the family and the community. And this may impact people's ability to be able to work well at their job because of some of these things that are going on. There's this nice term that I learned, medically unexplained physical symptoms. So we didn't, I don't know, they came up with this acronym for it. But anyway, these are things that we see with people. They'll start experiencing things and they'll go see their doctor, and the doctor runs these tests and nothing shows up. And they're kind of like, okay. But we also see people who are, they may be increasing their alcohol and drug consumption, lots of caffeine use, more smoking, just a number of things that go on, but we see things happen in that realm. I think it's important too that we realize this happens to kids especially, because we often see these different kinds of things, very similar to what we see with adults. And when parents are impacted by that, if we think about that, when our kids are impacted, then what happens is that we're impacted by that. And so if we think about what's been going on with COVID right now in particular, but this can be true in other cases as well, other disasters, is that we've had people at home for a long period of time trying to teach school, maybe if their kids are in school, as well as other things that can add to the stress that a parent may already be feeling. So if the house got damaged and we had to move out of the house and we're somewhere else, that's a problem. Or in the case of when I was working up in the central Missouri area during the '93 flood, the New Franklin schools became the shelter for that area. And so that was before the end of the school year when that happened, that the flooding began. And so kids are out of school and we've got families living in the school and different kinds of things like that. So it's important that we realize, and maybe another thing to think about is that how do we try and help accommodate these parents so that they can function better as part of that disaster recovery? This gets back into thinking about that mitigation, planning, preparedness, and that so that we have a better recovery. When we do things on that front end, and that is a cycle. It's a cycle. We learn something from this disaster, so we input that information to the next phase of our planning, our treatment of disaster, if you will, for the next round, because there will be a next disaster. And a lot of the things we do for any disaster often apply to our other disasters. So it's important to remember that. We also have issues with what we call high-risk populations. So when people are in a situation where it was a very severe type of disaster, Greenberg, Kansas, for example, when the town was pretty much level, or there's been loss of life, they were very fortunate. Loss of family members, again, if we think about right now, or the duration of exposure. So we've been asked to shelter in place, if you will, or quarantine for a long period of time. So we have some of these kinds of things that are going on, and different people have different parts of these. The second point on here lists many kinds of populations. So women are often caregivers, so that's an issue. Kids don't really understand things. Elderly people, in this case, we're talking about people who are not physically, are more vulnerable physically. And then just what does it mean for some of these? Ethnic minority is another one here. There's some other ones here like poverty, loss of economic livelihood. All of those right now are very much in tune with what we're seeing as far as COVID going on. But we often see these too. Businesses will have to close down because it was flooded. I'm thinking about a lumber yard that it was nice that the employees were able to go back and work some as they cleaned up the place. But at the same time, they did have a period of time that they were off after that flooding event. Other populations that are at risk, people who have had previous traumas. So if you've had, and it doesn't matter what the trauma is, if you were in a bad car wreck, you're already vulnerable. People who have experienced PTSD, and that goes along with, I've got veterans down here at the bottom, because we have lots of issues going on or can have with some of our different populations. People who have other behavioral disorders, so people with other mental health issues, anybody who's experienced a loss. So if you have, I'll just say, lost your farm, for example, or maybe your house was foreclosed on, or you had somebody who died previous to the disaster. So when we've experienced losses, we're already under stress. This next one is where people are under a lot of stress from multiple things, and we get this pile-up effect. It may be that you go along for a while, and then all of a sudden, boom, some little straw will break the camel's back. And again, our farmers are under a lot of stress with things that were going on before COVID started, but this is added to the situation. So how common is PTSD? That is one of the big issues that we tend to see. And what we know is that the problem with studying disasters is, I shouldn't say PTSD, I should say just post-disaster distress. The problem with studying disasters is that they don't behave well for us. We have a hard time studying them. So this big number here, 7 to 40%, is a big number because disasters differ so much. The number of people who are injured or maybe killed, what kind of losses, how severe was the disaster, all of those can play into, and then over time, if the study isn't done pretty quickly, people's memories fade. We don't know exact numbers because, as I said, the studies part. Most people will experience at least one type of stress symptom of that big list that we had there after events, the majority. And then we will have a few that will have long-term problems. A lot of times this stuff will resolve, but a lot of times that depends on. And if we aren't able to help people with some of these kinds of psychological, social issues, then what happens is they tend not to recover well. You will see people who they are given the resources or they're offered the resources and then nothing happens. They just stop doing the work on their house or other kinds of things. Everything comes to a halt. They're not able to keep maneuvering through the situation that they're in. Now we'll talk a little bit about PTSD. It's one of the severest stress reactions that we look at. You may know something about it. If you want to learn more about it, I have a resource list that I'm going to get to you guys, and that way, if you want to go look for more information on that, you'll be able to do that. Usually we see about 8% of US adults, and people can get PTSD from being in a bad car wreck, for example, and a lot of times we don't think about that. We usually associate that with people who are maybe veterans or some other pretty traumatic kind of event that has gone on. But when we look at rates in disasters, they often are much, much higher following disasters in that. And there's a lot of statistics out there, but it can be anywhere from 2 to 58%. And again, that's because we see a big difference in what happened with our disaster in terms of the severity and that kind of thing. So let's move over, shift, and talk a little bit about the community response phase. So when we have a disaster, and there's 4 points here: heroic, honeymoon, disillusionment, and recovery and reconstruction. They don't always happen in order. They might not always be present simply because maybe a community gets wiped out. Let's say the whole town gets flooded, and they make the decision that maybe they'll move it up on the hill, but not everybody stays, for example. So it can vary a lot. But when we talk about the heroic phase, that's the part where communities come together and they pull together and they work together, and it's usually immediately or during or immediately following the disasters. And there's this camaraderie that goes on. We still hang on to that in that honeymoon phase. And what happens there is that there's still focus on the community and the members in the community in terms of what's going on. But there's also some immobilization. We have outside agencies coming in, Red Cross, Salvation Army, other kinds of nonprofits, United Way, and other faith community groups that come in and help out. So there's still a lot of attention. And then what happens is that after a few months, things fall off the radar. And it might be quicker than that, depending on the disaster and what happens in the news cycle. And then people start to become disillusioned because some of those helpers leave. So they don't stay forever. If you're with Extension, we tend to be there. So that's kind of one of the nice things, to help with what might be going on and helping with that long-term type of construction. This is a very long, drawn out piece of what's going on. And people really start to understand what their losses are. They become often very discouraged by what's going on. There might start to be a lot of scapegoating or resentment that goes on, or disagreement in there. The unity in that community tends to dissipate and go by the wayside. There's a lot of arguments. And the last phase there is where we really talk about that brass tacks, if you will, of recovery and reconstruction. Sometimes it doesn't happen very quickly. So if we think about Hurricane Katrina and how long it's taken for them to do their recovery, can be a long term factor in terms of what goes on. It takes a long time for the social and economic kinds of activities to recur. And we may see that too with the COVID-19, very likely that we're going to see that. There's a gradual return to some normal routines. And again, depending on how much of the community was impacted, but that can change in terms of what we see and how people are feeling about things. There's not an absolute endpoint, if you will, and that recovery is not going to be, we go back to exactly the way that we were. There are also times when we have anniversaries that we may see people struggle on those anniversary dates. at least initially, for a few years. And there's a lot of difficult decisions to make about how we do that. And if there's some poor planning going on and preparedness, and this is where we really need to step in and help that process go, is trying to help people not be in such a hurry that we try and just get right back to normal, but we take that time to plan and get things prepared. So when we have that next disaster, we're going to be able to do much better in terms of our functioning on the other end. This is just a kind of fancy, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but you'll notice that there's a couple of places here in that disillusionment phase where we see that anniversary, and that right after the disaster, things go way up, we kind of level out, and then we drop when we get into that disillusionment phase. And then we gradually start going back up as we get into restoredness. But that's where we start working that preparedness again in terms of moving forward with what we want to do. So when we talk about other factors that impact recovery, and some of this I've talked about already, but what kind of individual and community losses did we see? Did we have a lot of death? Is there a lot of bereavement, and maybe loss of homes and that kind of thing? Sometimes only part of the community is impacted, and another part isn't. I had sort of an experience with this. One of my colleagues, we were at a national meeting, and she was sitting on the other side of the room, and she said, "We really didn't have much go on in Missouri this year." And I stood up and I went, "What part of the state were you in?" Because we'd had a lot of flooding over on our side of the state. So age of people affects it. Often we think that older people, that may be an issue, but sometimes when you've gone through disasters before, you go through fairly well. But again, it depends on the type of disaster. How you interpret it. Do you have good coping styles? Were you one of those people who your life was threatened, and how bad was the disaster? Any of the pre-existing emotional, past trauma, how was this disaster the same or different? So there are some similarities about what we're talking with the COVID, and maybe thinking about some bioterrorism kind of stuff, but we don't have a lot of well, we don't really have roadmaps to tell us what we need to do on some of this stuff. So we're learning, kind of like the '93 flood, as we go through this. And then there's also our secondary disaster effects, the job loss, economic loss, relocation, and any post-disaster experiences. I'm thinking about people being, they were told that they would get this, and then that didn't happen. Or they had, in order to get to work, they've got to drive 50 miles because they got to go all the way around. They can't just drive across that bridge across the river. And then what kind of social support do we have, and what kind of resources are available? So what do we do for individual support for people who are impacted by disasters? There's a number of things that we can do. And this is just methods that we can use. How do we talk to folks? We're going to talk a little bit about supportive communication. What about kids? Because if kids aren't doing well, then their parents are impacted. Where do we refer people for additional help? And what about responders? Sometimes we think that those folks who are doing the responding are not impacted, or they see this kind of stuff all the time, but they are very much impacted. So we need to kind of think about that. But while we are not exactly responders or counselors, we may be impacted by the actions we take. So one of the primary things is encourage people to use stress management techniques. So that's about getting back to their routines, who is their support system, eat well, rest, getting plenty of sleep, exercise, but I get out and exercise every day. And I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. It's about getting some physical activity that regenerates you as you go along. Rest when you need to, not just the sleep, but resting. And then, as I said already, limiting that media intake. Distribute information packets on disaster. So this is a technique where we let people know. It might be handouts, for example. TOT is Triumph Over Tragedy. That will be one of the resources that I'll have on the sheet that you get. But having information about what people should expect, because what we're trying to do is, I'm going to call it, kind of inoculate people in terms of what's going on. Normal reactions for an abnormal situation. So we expect to see these things. If they go longer than this, then that would potentially indicate there's some kind of issue. What are the services that are available? Are you in an area where there are professional services available? And I want to pick on the faith community. Sometimes some of our ministers have been trained too as well. And so that might be a place where people are comfortable. We want to talk with them about their experiences. One of the best things I learned during the '93 flood was that by my listening to people tell their stories, even though I didn't have something to give them physically, that helped them. I ran into some folks, as I said, I was in central Missouri. I happened to be in the mall one day. I ran into a family that I'd been dealing with, and they were like, oh, you helped us so much. And this was about a year later or so. And what struck me, I couldn't figure out because I hadn't made sure that they got some particular money or other kinds of resources and that sort of thing. And so I asked them what they meant. And they said, well, you listened to what we had gone through. And that was so important to them. So our listening is really important. And again, develop those referral lists in the event that people do need to go to a higher level of assistance for mental health. And there may be other resources that they need in the area. Food banks, for example, or clothing, or other agencies or organizations that help out when we're in a disaster situation. You're going to get this set of slides. So this right down here, but I will put it on the resource, is also something that is available. There is a cost. It's $20 to get this Triumph Over Tragedy, but it's very, very good in terms of the information that it provides for that. What about supportive communication? So it's not a substitute for mental health care. If people need to get mental health care, we need to help them to get to that place. And that's where that list comes in handy. It may be that sometimes people aren't able to make that call. I think about a colleague of mine who told me a story about how she talked with a woman and said, here are the things that you need to do. And the next week, the woman's sitting there by her desk and hasn't gotten a thing done. And she realized that this woman at this point was just not even able to help make that, or not make that call for herself. So she helped her with that process. Let people decide when and if they're going to tell you about their experiences. Don't push them to do that. Just listen to what they're saying. It's about that reflective listening. There's another resource called Psychological First Aid, and that'll be another one that'll be on the list that helps you to learn some of these reflective kind of listening skills for somebody. So it's about that repeating back what you heard, clarifying, and just being very respectful with people as they're talking through that process, And if they don't want to talk, wait until they've decided. And the other thing is that we want to monitor our reaction. Our body language is the biggest part of what we communicate. So our facial expressions, anything that we may do in terms of our body, if we cross our arms, kind of like we don't want to hear what they have to say, number of different things about our reactions, because that can shut people down from talking with us. Empathy. So these are the points in terms of that supportive communication. Empathy is part of that. How are you holding up? It's an open-end question, gives people that opportunity to fill things in. Normalize. Again, this is that abnormal thing, and you're having a normal reaction. Recognition of efforts to cope. So not everybody is totally unable to cope. We all have coping mechanisms. Some are better than others, but we want to recognize when they're doing those kinds of things. Self-care. Again, I mentioned already, things about eating well, getting enough sleep, resting when we need to, taking time for yourself, doing fun things. Sometimes people get caught up in all the things they have to do to get their house back in order, for example. And unfortunately, we can't work all the time. We have to take that time in order to take care of ourselves. Tolerance for change. Things are not going to go back to the way that they were. We've got a new normal coming. We don't know what that looks like right now necessarily. And how can we instill hope? People often have gone through tough times in their lives, and we can help them, encourage them in terms of they're going to get through this as well. The last one here, most of us are very reluctant to ask for help when we probably need it. One way to maybe help people, besides telling them it's okay, but is if we think about and maybe remark to them, they help people all the time. So now it's okay for you to ask for that help when you're in need of it. So again, helping people to understand where they're going with stuff. This I just want to mention mostly because if parents are talking to their kids, there's a lot of things that we can do to help them understand. We actually have a guide that we developed back after the Joplin tornado, and it goes through some of the things for different age groups, because we want to look at different things for different age groups as we go through this process. Clear my throat here. So sometimes when we first go about doing this process, we may feel pretty uncomfortable about it. The big thing is to remember most people just need somebody to listen to them and to provide reassurance, because their world has really been shaken at this point. So there's a lot of things that we can do. Again, this is going to impact people across their life. It's not just this isolated thing over here and we'll put a box around it. It is an issue that is going to play out across our lives, because we may have many aspects of the community that have been impacted by this situation, aside from the individual themselves. So what do we do if we think, if we're in a position where we're pretty sure somebody may need some additional help? So it's 3 or 4 months after the event, and this person is just not really quite getting back into life. They're struggling. So what we want to do is we're going to use this acronym here. Ask if they would want some more help, and then talk about what are some of the possible referrals. In that packet that we might give to people, that's a good place to put that information, but we may have those available and be able to just offer it to them. If they take it and they do nothing with it, they're making a choice. We can't force them to do that, but we can also talk to them about that it's okay to seek help, about the stigma. We're hearing a lot right now, around people in particular about suicide and that kind of thing. That's something that's been we've been hearing a lot in the media and that kind of stuff in terms of that. And this is another place where people are often reluctant to seek that help. And it may be that sometimes we can even, we can say, well, maybe you know somebody who needs this, and then they take that piece of paper home and read it themselves, and then maybe they reach out for that help. Part of it is that sometimes people are not sure what to expect for help. So if you've taken the time, and if you're in an organization or an employer perhaps that has an EAP, that might be a way to do that, or maybe it's part of an insurance package. EAP is Employee Assistance Program. It may be that you do a little bit of research, talk to the provider and find out some of that information so that people are less concerned about what might happen. I want to talk about this vicarious trauma because when I said maybe you weren't directly impacted by a disaster, but also in talking with people with regard to disaster or some other kind of trauma, it's often one that we talk more about people who are working with victims, law enforcement, emergency medical services, firefighters, also our psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., that kind of thing. We often talk about that. But even as a lay helper, when we hear that, or maybe we help at a disaster recovery center and people come in and they're telling their story, we may need to debrief a little bit ourselves. We take on some of that. We want to go out and rescue the whole world and kind of thing. And so we may start to identify with that survivor, or our empathy, and we start doing more than we need to or should. And what I mean by that is that we start overextending ourselves to provide for that person. We can't do all and be everything for everybody. Again, we need to work in this case about that, reducing that stress as that person who may be having some vicarious trauma symptoms, or we're just doing this work. We need to make sure that we're getting enough sleep, that we get that exercise, we're eating well, we're playing, we're balancing work. During the '93 flood, there was a woman who overextended herself and ended up having a car accident. They attributed the accident. She went off the road someplace. And so again, this is the kind of stuff that can have an impact on us. If we're taking care of ourselves, we are not likely to be impacted by it. I'm not saying that we're immune totally. But also remember that you need some care. If you're helping people and you're pouring water out of that pitcher frequently, you need to pour some back in. And so again, that balance of work, play, and rest, as well as these other self-care kinds of items. Might be that you use some spiritual resources. If connecting with other people is something that helps you, you need to let people give to you as well. You're not just that helper person in terms of what's going on. So again, how we take care of ourselves. There's one thing that I'm going to talk real briefly about here, because we're running on time, and that is that social capital. There's Daniel Ulrich, who's done quite a bit of research on this. He moved down to New Orleans just before Katrina hit. Neighbors came over, this is social capital in action, and said, You and your wife and kid have never been through a hurricane. We suggest that you evacuate. And so he said, we packed ourselves into the car and we left. And he said that was the best advice he ever got. And that's social capital. That's that piece where we're looking out for each other. It's that formal and informal bonds that tie us together. It helps coordinate actions so that we are able to recover more quickly. It's kind of this citizen policymaker kinds of things. When we have people come in, we often have a problem with disrupting our flow of things. Moving to another room because my battery started running low. I hope I keep my connectivity here. We often focus on physical damages. I apologize. Shit. We are trying to help people, and there's a lot of things that we can do in terms of how we take care of ourselves and take care of other people. So the more we do for the psychosocial part, the better off we are and the better our recovery will be as we go through things. So with that, I will open it up for any questions.